Hi everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. So in today's video we'll talk about use callback hook. So we'll discuss about what is use callback hook in React and how to use it and what problem does it solve. And at the end of the video we'll also talk about some of the best practices or some of the things that you should be keep in mind before you use the use callback hook. Okay, so the question arises is that what is the use callback hook? So use callback hook, it's a React hook that takes a callback function as an input and it returns as a memoized version of that callback function. So when we should be using it is that the use callback hook will be useful for you when you need to pass a callback function as a prop to the child component, but you don't want the child component to be re-rendered unnecessarily whenever the parent component re-renders. So that is why we will be using the use callback hook. So we'll talk about more about that in details in later. So now let's take a look at the syntax of the use callback hook. So on the right side we have the syntax of the use callback hook. You can see, so it takes two parameters. One is the callback function and second one is the dependency array. So as I already said you, like the use callback hook, it takes a callback function and returns as a memoized version of that callback function. So now the question arises is that when it should create that memoized function. Now when it should create that thing we can control by passing different types of dependency. So we can pass different types of dependency. So here if we pass, so basically if the dependency that we are passing, if it is an empty array, that means it will only create that memoized function only when the component gets mounted, and that is for the first time, and after that it will never create that. Okay, and now if we don't pass anything, so as the dependency array we are not passing anything, so in that case what it will do is that it will create that memoized callback function for every re-render of the component. Now if if we pass some value to that, so if we pass some dependency as the dependency array, so then it will create that memoized callback function only when those dependencies have been changed. So you can see like this dependency array thing is kind of similar to the useEffect hook. So here in the use callback hook, by passing different types of dependency array, we can control when we want that memoized callback function to be created. So now let's try to understand how use callback hook improve performance and how it can stop unnecessary re-render of the components. So basically we know that, so basically suppose inside a parent component you have a child component. Now whenever that, by default what happens is that whenever that parent component gets re-rendered, the child component that is also get re-rendered. So that is the default behavior of the React. But it does not, the child component does not need to be re-rendered every time. Okay, so suppose we are not changing any data inside the child component, so in that case we do not need to re-render the child component, but just because the parent component is being re-rendered, the child also getting re-rendered, and that is an unnecessarily re-rendering of the child component. And to stop that, what we can do is that, suppose we are passing some props from the parent component to child component, and now when that props change, then only we want the child component to re-render. And when the props is not changing, even if the parent component gets re-rendered, we do not want the child component to be re-rendered. Only when the props is changing, then only we want the child component to be re-rendered. So that behavior we can achieve using use callback hook. So what use callback does is that, suppose you are passing some function as a prop from parent to child. So what use callback does is that it wraps that function and it returns as a memoized version of that function, and now we can return that memoized version of that function as a prop to the child component. So now what it will do is that, so even if the parent component gets re-rendered, the child component will not be re-rendered, because that the function we are passing the memoized function. So what happens is that inside the parent component, whenever you are re-rendering the component, that all the function inside that is also recreated. But since we are wrapping our function inside the use callback hook, then it is not recreating that function. So even if the component gets re-rendered, the function it's not being recreated, and that memoized function we are passing to the child, and hence even if the parent component gets re-rendered, the props that we are passing to the child, that is actually not changing, that is still the same props, and hence the child component will not be re-rendered. and that is how we can use useCallback hook to improve performance and prevent unnecessary re-render of the child component. So now let's see how you can implement that in the code. So now I am inside of my VS Code and I've created a blank project using Vite, and I've started the local server. So if we see, yeah, it is working fine. Okay, so the first thing what I will do is that I will create two state called count A and count B using useState. And now I will create two functions. One is handle click A and handle click B that will basically increase these counters. So I have created two functions, handle click A and handle click B. So now I will print the value of the count A inside the application. And I will also create a button that will increase the count A. Okay, now if we refresh the screen and if we click on this button, see, yeah, the count is increasing. So now what we will do is that we will create a child component, and inside that child component we will pass the count B as a prop. And now we will import that child component here. So now what we will do is that we will pass the count B and the handle click B as a prop to the child component. And now here we will just extract them. And now inside the child component we will display the count B. And we also create a button that will increase that count B. So we will be using this prop only, handle click B. So now if we refresh the screen and if we click on the count B, you can see the count B is increasing. And also if we click on the count A is also increasing. So basically what we have done is that we have created two state, count A and count B, and count A value we have displayed in the app component only, and count B we have passed that count B and the handle click B, those two as a prop to the child component, and inside the child component we are increasing the count, and inside the child component we are displaying the count B and we are increasing the count B. Now this code is working fine, but there is a slight one issue, so I'll just show you that. So if we use a useEffect hook here, so basically we have created a useEffect hook, and this useEffect hook will run whenever the child component will be re-rendered. So basically we want to see that when does the child component gets re-rendered, or if there is any unnecessarily re-render of the child component. So if we refresh the screen, so if we click on the count A, we can see the child component is re-rendering, and if we click on the count B, then also the child component is re-rendering. So here the problem is, you can see, so the count A, we are displaying the count A value inside the app component, but when we are increasing the count A, then also the child component is being re-rendered. But that is not needed, right? Because count A value, we are only showing the count A value in the app component. You are not showing the count A value inside the child component. So whenever we are changing the count A value, we do not need to update the child component because it is not using that count A. So that is what, that is a example of unnecessarily re-rendering of the child component. And in this example, it might be a small issue, but in a real world application, when you have a lots of child component, and then if there are component that is being unnecessarily re-rendered, then in that case, it will hurt our application performance. So now let's see how you can stop that. So here, as I already said, that count A, whenever we are changing the count A, it is re-rendering the child also, but that is not needed because the count A value, you are only using the count A inside the app component. You are not using the count A value inside the child component. So whenever the count A is increasing, we do not need to re-render the child component. So now let's see how you can stop that unnecessarily re-rendering using the useCallback hook. So to fix this problem, what we have to do is that we have to memoize this callback function. So whatever the handle click b that is there, we have to memoize that, and we have to return that memoized version of that handle click b as a prop to the child component. So now let's see how you can do that. So now what I will do is that I will create so basically I will pass this function inside the use callback hook, and I will create a memoized version of that. So let's do that. So I will create a new function called memoized handle click b. Now we will use the use callback hook here, and it takes that callback function as the parameter. So we will be writing the function parameter function statement here. And as a dependency, we can pass different dependencies. So here in this case, we will pass the dependency as count b, because we want this new function to be created whenever the count b changes. Okay, so that is done. Now we will pass that handle click b as a prop to the child component. Now if we refresh the screen and if we click on the increase a, we can see even if we have done that, then also our child component is getting re-rendered. Now there is one thing that we are missing, is that we have to make that child component as a pure component as in react.memo. So we will pass that, before exporting we will make it as react.memo. Now if we save that, if we refresh the page, now if we click on the count a, we can see the count a value is changing, but it is not re-rendering the count, the component b. So you can see if we click on the count b, that is re-rendering the child component, that is expected, that is fine. But if we click on the count a, it is not re-rendering our child component, and hence we can stop that unnecessarily re-rendering of the child component. So that is how you can use callback hook. So just note that so whenever you are passing some function as a prop to the child component, then make sure that you are using use callback hook. So when you are using use callback hook and you are passing that function inside that use callback hook, then it returns as a memoized version of that function. And this memoized handle click b, this function will only be created so whenever the app component gets re-rendered, then memoized handle click b, this function will not be recreated. This function will only be recreated when the component gets re-rendered and also the count b changes. And whenever the count b changes, then only we are creating a new version. So we are passing that here. So technically we are passing a new prop, and whenever the prop is changing, then only we want the child component to be re-rendered. And that is what we are doing here. And yeah, and one more thing is that whenever you are using use callback hook with a child component, so make sure that the child component must be a pure component. That means the child also, child should be wrapped inside the react.memo. So that is one important thing to note, because if we remove that, if we just remove this thing, if we just do export, if we just do this, if we refresh the screen, you can see whenever we click on the count a, then also the count, so the child component gets re-rendered. So use callback is not working. So to make the use callback working, make sure that you are also making that child component as a pure component. So inside the functional component, we have something called like react.memo. So we have to, before exporting our child component, we have to pass our child component inside the react.memo. So that way it will create a pure child component. And now you can see how you can, you can stop unnecessarily re-rendering of the child component. And there is one more thing that I wanted to discuss, which is that, so basically use callback is useful whenever we are passing function as a prop. Okay, so just note that whenever we are passing function as a prop, then only it is important. So in this case, you can see we have this function. So we have a handle click function, handle click b. So we are passing that handle click b as a prop, and handle click b is a function, so we are passing a function as a prop. To optimize that, the use callback will be useful. So let's see if we just remove that. So suppose we are not passing that function as a prop, we are only passing that count b as a prop. Okay, and now so I will just create a function here, handle click b, and inside the app component only I will create a button called increase counter b. So if we refresh the screen, so just note that the difference is that I will remove that also because that is not being used, and I'll also remove that button here. So if we refresh the screen, so yeah, so whatever we have done is that, so basically what we have done is that we are just passing the count b. We are not passing, so in this case we are not passing the, the function handle click b, we are not passing that as a prop, we are just passing the count b. Now if we refresh that, if we click on the count a, you can see that the count, so the child component is not being re-rendered. If we click on the count b, it is re-rendering, that is expected. But if we click on the count a, then it is not re-rendering, and in this case we are not, so we can just comment this out, we are not using that. So see, in this case we are not even using the use callback, and then also we are able to stop that unnecessarily re-render of the child component. This is because in this case we are passing the value as a prop, we are not passing a function as a prop. So that is the one thing you need to keep in mind, because so here you are passing the count b, so we are not passing a function, we are just passing a value as a prop. So when you are passing as a value as a prop, then you do not need to use the use callback. And here our child component is already, it's a pure component, so that means the whatever count that is passing, so whenever the child component, whenever the app component gets re-rendered, so whenever you are clicking on the count a, the app component gets re-rendered and it is passing the count b to that, and then since the child b is a pure component, it is checking if the prop count b has been changed or not. So if the prop has not been changed, then we do not need to re-render the child component. So here the important thing is to note is that, so whenever you are passing value as a prop, then you do not need to use callback. But when you are passing function as a prop, then you need to use callback hook, to stop, to create a memoized function, to create a memoized version of that prop. So using that use callback hook, this is how you can stop unnecessarily re-rendering of the child component. So now let's talk about some of the best practices you should be following before you can use the use callback hook. So the first thing is that don't use callback hook for all the functions in your component. So make sure you are using use callback hook for those functions which actually need to be memoized. So you need to find out if there is any function that you are passing as a prop to the child component. Make sure that you are memoizing that. And now the second thing is that, so make sure whenever you are using use callback hook, make sure that you are passing the correct dependencies, because if you miss out to pass some dependencies, then what will happen is that the memoized function will not be recreated. So that is why you need to be very careful about passing the correct dependencies when you are using the use callback hook. And now the next thing is that you should be using use callback hook with the React.memo. So in order for use callback hook to work properly, you need to make sure that the child component, it's a pure component, because if the child component it's not a pure component, then even if you have used the use callback hook to pass the props, but that that will not stop the unnecessary re-rendering. So in order to stop the unnecessary re-rendering, make sure that you are using use callback hook, and also you are making that child component as a pure component using the React.memo. And the last thing is that so we use the use callback hook to improve the performance of the application. So it's very important for us to check that if after using the use callback hook, you need to check if the application performance has actually been improved or not, because there might be some other factors as well, or other bottlenecks as well, that might be hurting your application performance. So make sure that you are checking that, and after using the use callback, just measure your performance of your React application and see if the using use callback has actually made a difference in the application performance or not. And as always, like, you need to test the code very well, because using use callback might lead to some unusual bugs as well. So make sure that you are testing the code properly, and after that, and you need to ensure that there is not any unusual issues after using the useCallback hook. So that's it for this video. I hope you have understood the concept, and if you did, then please don't forget to like this video and also subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.